Welcome back to Proxhammer, everybody, and today we're finally going to be doing the Craftworld Eldar versus Astra Millitarum or Imperial Guard review and matchup, and we're going to be taking the first impressions of the new Codex. So, Imperial Guard just got a new Codex, and word on the street is it's pretty OP. Has a lot of good tools for dealing with a lot of different enemies, has extreme amounts of damage potential, and is extremely effective in the objective game, which of course, competitive match play is all about the objectives. So, how do you beat the new Imperial Guard? Imperial Guard was actually a matchup that I believe was always a little bit tricky for Eldar, especially newer Eldar players who didn't really know the matchup and were maybe a little bit less experienced with the army. And now, I think that the Imperial Guard matchup is probably even harder for new players, but now with the new Codex, even really difficult for experienced or advanced players. And the reason why I say that is because the Imperial Guard now have a lot of different tools of dealing with our little tricks that we like to pull on a vast majority of armies out there. So, what exactly is it that the Astra Millitarum or Imperial Guard have in store for the Craftworld Eldar, and why is the matchup now that much more difficult? So what we're going to be doing in this video, obviously, is taking a look at the matchup, seeing what works in our army, what doesn't work, and what kind of adaptations we need to make as a, faction to be able to compete with the new Imperial Guard Codex, which, by the way, I do expect there to be several nerfs to the Imperial Guard Codex. A lot of people complained about Leagues of Votann when it came out and everything like that, but as I think some of you will realize as you start playing against fine-tuned Imperial Guard armies, it's just Leagues of Votann is a cakewalk compared to Imperial Guard. So especially with the Eldar matchup, they're just very tough to deal with. So what we're going to do is obviously look at that, and we're going to see in what ways we can go ahead and take the fight to the Astra Millitarum and beat them, even with all of the new goodies that they have now. So a quick overview of the video: we're going to be doing army-wide special rules, key stratagems, relics, and warlord traits. We're going to be looking at the most powerful units and their counters, of course. And lastly, we're going to be looking at what to watch out for and how to play against the new Astra Millitarum, or as I like to call them, Imperial Guard. So a couple of the key special rules that you're going to be encountering in pretty much every single game you play against Imperial Guard, bar none. And the first one is turret weapons. So turret weapons are something where our tricks and traps don't really work against Imperial Guard tanks, right? We can't just throw something at them to tie them up. And that's because turret weapons, if engaged in combat, can fire outside of melee at -1 to hit. So that's pretty good. I mean, most of these tanks have a variable amount of shots. Most of them have the blast keyword, so they're doing even more damage against larger units. If they're targeting larger units, that is. There's nothing that says they have to. They also get +1 to hit to the turret weapon, so if they're not in combat, they're hitting on 3+ with that turret weapon. And this applies to all turret weapons. So those are the guns on top of the tanks. Those are the Lehman Russ battle cannons, demolisher cannons. And I believe even the Chimera multi-lasers and heavy bolters get it as well. So even those vehicles can fire outside of combat with this ability, which is pretty powerful. And it's definitely something as an Eldar player you should be wary of, because it means that tying up these things in combat with any kind of unit is just not going to be able to slow these things down. They're still going to be able to target your key units, and engaging them in combat is not going to make your other units safe. The next thing you're going to be invariably facing are orders. And orders are basically these things which officers in the army can issue to certain units. So mostly infantry, sentinels, and regimental units, things like that. But also tanks as well. So basically these orders confer bonuses on those units. And the thing about orders is, unlike psychic powers and different abilities, these are very easy to use and basically guaranteed, and can hit multiple units within 6 inches of that ordered unit. So let's say there's 3 Imperial Guard units, all within 6 inches of each other. You order one of those units, and every unit within 6, up to 3 additional units, I believe it's 3 additional units, can also benefit from that order. And of course, you can have multiple orders in one turn. The only thing is that, of course, Imperial Guard units can only benefit from one order at a time. So this would be, there to prevent people from basically issuing multiple different orders to the same unit and essentially making them god tier for only 65 points. So units can only benefit from one order at a time, but if they're close enough together, pretty much all the units in the vicinity can benefit from that order. So if you have 3 or 4 Imperial Guard squads close together, they can all benefit from first rank fire, second rank fire, or take aim and things like that. So definitely something that's very deadly. Although, to be honest, there's no real counter to it. So you kind of have to just pretty much sit there and take it unless you take out the command squads. But in a vast majority of cases, those units will be hidden. And normally, orders can only be issued within 12 inches, so this would make the command squad pretty vulnerable. However, most Imperial Guard players are going to outfit their command units with the Master Vox, which basically allows orders within 24 inches instead of the normal 12. So every unit can get a free Vox caster, that's standard with every single unit, and the Master Vox can be taken with the command squad, which means that orders can be issued within 24 inches. So you can easily have a command squad in the backfield, behind some terrain, obscuring terrain, can't be seen, can't be shot at really, and is well screened by enemy infantry units, which will also be benefiting from those orders outside of 24 inches. So this makes it very hard for you to actually get in there to kill the command squads. Now, there are ways to do it, obviously, but it's just much harder to do so, especially in the first few turns of the game. So we're going to be talking now about some key stratagems you have to watch out for that the Imperial Guard have access to. So the first one is field promotion. Then we have vengeful salute, ingrained precision, orbital interference, and lastly, overcharged last cells. And of course, the Imperial Guard have many more stratagems, but these are the key ones that I feel will give us the most trouble. And the ones that you'll probably see the most of in every game. The first one is field promotion. Now, this one was a little bit odd. A lot of people probably wouldn't say this is that big of a deal, but it actually is very good because it essentially means that you can cycle through warlord traits for essentially almost no additional CP. So it costs 1 CP, and basically when the enemy warlord dies, you choose another character to replace him, and that model gains a warlord trait. Again, this is 1 command point, and that warlord trait is free. So while it may not seem like a big deal, if you are going after commanders, this could easily be used to just cycle through different command squads and make it really hard for you to actually take out the warlord trait that you desire to take out. So really makes it very difficult to eliminate those certain abilities from the game. And another thing about this ability is that certain Strike Force missions currently in Nephilim, and this may change with the upcoming data slate that's coming up, but essentially what this means is that in certain missions, Imperial Guard don't really care about losing the warlord in the last couple turns because they can just field promote to another model on the battlefield. So what that means is this is a really easy way to deny your ability to actually slay the enemy warlord. And I'm not even sure if this is going to be FAQ'd or something, but it's kind of ambiguous. It's one of those things where, yes, you did technically kill the enemy warlord, but there's still an enemy warlord on the battlefield after this command point is used. So do I still get the points for it? Does the enemy get the negative for it? Who knows? I know there's a couple missions in Nephilim that do give you bonus points for slaying the warlord, or just give you some sort of detriment for not having a warlord on the battlefield, and Imperial Guard really don't have to worry about this. So even though a lot of players might look at this and not think it's that big of a deal, it actually can be very effective and very good in a number of missions. And of course, who doesn't like a free warlord trait whenever you want it, whenever your warlord dies? So again, might not come up that much in a game, but once or twice in a game it might come up, and it's going to be pretty powerful when it does. Now, the thing people are complaining about the most probably is the Vengeful Salute. So the Vengeful Salute basically allows a tank to shoot with its turret weapon on death at ballistic skill 5+. Now, the thing is, this can happen in any phase. So for Eldar, it's really detrimental because really we have 3 phases in each turn where we could potentially kill something, right? Even the movement phase, we can potentially kill something, but that happens a lot less often. So our psychic phase, we can kill a tank. Our shooting phase, we can kill a tank. And of course, in our assault phase, we can also kill a tank. We have many units that are capable of this, especially finishing off tanks and stuff like that. So essentially, the tank can shoot with its turret weapon on death at ballistic skill 5. Now, this may not seem like that much, but again, I do believe that the +1 to hit is still in effect here with the turret weapon ability. And it can target anything it could target normally. So that means it needs line of sight and range. But as long as it has those things, it doesn't have any other requirements. So for example, it doesn't need to shoot at the unit that killed it, which would, obviously make it a little bit more tricky to use and stuff like that. So it can shoot at anything it wants. And you really have to think carefully before destroying an enemy tank. So my little tip for this is that if you are going to target enemy tanks, make sure that you shoot everything else in your army first, which means all of your swooping hawks. Make sure you shoot those first and battle focus behind terrain immediately so that you can't be targeted by this. Also, make sure that you get every single unit that is going to shoot before it actually, or I should say before you actually think about destroying that tank. So it kind of messes with your order of operation a little bit. Now, you don't really need to worry about this on things like chimeras and stuff like that. Chimeras are not going to be using this command point probably. Their turret weapon just isn't good enough. But with the Leman Russes and the Rogel Dorns and things like that, you do have to really watch out for this because they do have very powerful turret weapons that can easily slaughter something like a unit of, striking scorpions. If they're in a position to charge or something like that, you want to make sure you're careful about that. They can take out your striking scorpions before they're able to charge something, or your howling banshees or whatever, right? So you do want to make sure that whatever you're going to shoot is already behind line of sight with their battle focus or their fire and fade or whatever you have, so that they cannot be targeted with this ability. So do watch out for this. Do make sure that if you are going to shoot and kill these Leman Russ battle tanks, it's at the very end of the turn when they don't have as many targets to shoot at. Ingrained Precision is an ability that basically allows the Born Soldiers to proc on a 5+, further boosting its damage. And this is especially deadly on Kasrkin and Scion units that have the hot shot last guns. So just a quick kind of reminder of what Born Soldiers is. Born Soldiers is essentially the guard version of Hail of Doom, which means that every 6 to hit auto wounds. So this can just become absolutely insane. And of course, the Ingrained Precision stratagem allows this Born Soldier's ability to proc on a 5+. Now, honestly, just a quick tangent on this for a second. I'm not going to go into this too much because I wasn't really going to cover the special kind of regimental traits that you could put on your Imperial Guardsmen. But it's generally accepted in the current state of the Imperial Guard Codex that Born Soldiers is pretty much the default choice for every single list that wants to play competitively. So if you are going against an Imperial Guard player, 9 times out of 10, they are going to be using the Born Soldiers trait, which does count as 2 traits, but it's absolutely brutal. It essentially means that if any of your units are caught out in the open, even last guns are just going to be able to whittle them down to death. And I wouldn't even expect our more heavily armed units like Wraith Guard and Wraith Blades to survive against this for very long if they're caught out in the open. And 9 times out of 10, if you're using Wraith Blades, you charge into an enemy guard unit, you wipe them out completely because guard are terrible in combat. And then you're stuck out in the open, and even if you do consolidate into an enemy unit, guess what? They have a stratagem that basically allows them to shoot into combat. So your Wraith Blades are going to die a horrible death, and Born Soldiers is really the reason why Imperial Guard are going to be able to do that. And honestly, it's not just Wraith units that are going to have trouble with this. Other armies, tough units like Death Guard and things like that are going to have a lot of issues dealing with this trait. It's absolutely brutal, especially on units that have some AP like Kasrkin and of course Scions. But anyway, so just be aware of that. Ingrained Precision is going to be a pretty serious stratagem for killing anything remotely tough in your army if they can draw line of sight to it. Orbital interference is another stratagem that you do have to watch out for. It does require a master of the fleet, but in my opinion, every Imperial Guard army should be prioritizing taking this, and here's why. This is a really powerful ability to basically mess with your opponent's reserves. And especially if you're playing a more reserve-based list, this can absolutely destroy any kind of strategies you have in the first couple of turns to Alpha Strike. And essentially what it does is it basically delays one unit of yours from deploying from reserve on turns 1 and 2. It's a one-use only ability or stratagem, but it can absolutely destroy a potential Alpha Strike. Let's say that you want to bring in a squad of fire dragons to kill that Leman Russ battle tank on the flank of the battlefield. Well, guess what? Your opponent can use this and delay them so that the Leman Russ battle tank can be assuredly safe for another turn. And this can be really exceptionally deadly against Eldar because Eldar require every single unit to be working in perfect cohesion with each other. So oftentimes when you're doing an Alpha Strike, you need every single unit that you are going to bring down available because every single unit is going to be performing a specific task that's able to dismantle the enemy army. Well, here we go. Orbital interference can basically destroy that plan outright and basically delay you until turn 3, where you essentially will lose a lot of the advantages that you had. Again, a lot of your army may or may not be alive during turn 3, if you're planning to Alpha Strike with a lot of reserves. So again, this can be a very good ability for deterring and messing with Alpha Strikes. So again, pretty powerful ability, and honestly one that you will probably see taken very often. And then, of course, we have Overcharged Last Cells, which basically turns Kasrkins and Scions into blenders, allowing them to cause up to 6 mortal wounds per unit targeted. So when combined with orders, buffs, and of course the Barbican's Key, which I'll talk about in a second, a unit of 10 Kasrkins can easily cause up to 15 mortal wounds across 3 units, plus their normal damage. So this is absolutely obscene, and this is one of the combinations that I think a lot of players were not ready for when the Codex came out. And having played several games against a new Imperial Guard now over the weekend, I can tell you from experience, the Barbican's Key combo with this Overcharged Last Cell and orders and stuff like that, it's really powerful, it's really extreme, and it does a lot of damage. And, honestly, if you're not properly screened out, it's going to kill several key units of yours, and you might just lose the game right then and there. Really depends on how well you screen out and how well you can actually defend against this. There's definitely some ways you can reduce the power of the combination, but, like I said, I have to be honest with you guys, it's a very powerful combo, and even if it's used on just a couple of units, something is going to die when this combo goes off, so be wary of that. And going on to relics, we have the Barbican's Key, the Clarion Proclamatus, and of course the Kurov's Aquila. The Barbican's Key is arguably one of the best relics in the Imperial Guard Codex, especially with Kasrkin. So the thing about it is you can't really use it on anything but infantry, and the Kasrkin unit is the obvious choice for this. There's no real other infantry unit that's worth taking this on, but essentially what it allows is a once per game teleport ability for an infantry unit. You still have to stay outside of 9 inches, but you can reroll charges when it does go off. And like I said, it's perfect for Kasrkins because Kasrkins can't deep strike normally. So it allows them to teleport close so they can be in rapid fire range for that Barbican's Key Overcharged Last Cell combo that I talked about earlier. And the worst part about this is that it can't be forewarned because it technically doesn't count as a reserve. So it doesn't count as a reserve move, and therefore you can't use forewarned against it. You really can't do much against it except use line of sight to your advantage and, of course, screen out your opponent. So, again, very powerful relic and one that you do have to watch out for. Luckily, though, it's a once-a-game maneuver that you can't use more than once. So, thank God for that, but it is very strong still. The next one is one that I actually particularly like. It's the Clarion Proclamatus. It's basically an unlimited range Master Vox. So this one's kind of cool because this allows Imperial Guard to spread out more and, in my opinion, waste less points on command squad. So I know a lot of Imperial Guard players like to take multiple command units, But with this, you actually don't need that many command units. You only probably need one, maybe two, because you can have an unlimited range on your Master Vox. And what this will allow you to do is actually remain hidden much easier while splashing orders to units, regardless of where they are on the board. So very good ability, honestly. I haven't seen it in a lot of lists yet, I'm going to be honest, but I actually think it has the potential to be very effective in a number of builds. It helps you decrease the amount of points that you have to spend on command squads and stuff like that, because you're able to issue these orders wherever you have troops. And then we have the Kurof's Aquila, which basically increases the command cost of one stratagem that you just used for the remainder of the game. So this is really kind of crappy, honestly, because basically what this is let's say that you love using matchless agility or something like that on your units, and you want to have that in your back pocket to reroll a battle focus roll if you need it. Well, your enemy can basically make it another command point. And this is not just a one-use item. This remains for the rest of the game. So that means that matchless agility stratagem is now going to cost 2 command points for the remainder of the game. This is insanely detrimental to a lot of our strategies. And honestly, it's really hard to get around. There's not much you can do. It's kind of like, if you don't kill this relic user by the time you use matchless agility, you're going to have to spend an extra 2 command points for it. Or, just 1 extra command point. So that's 2 in total. But still, that's a huge command point drain, and that can be really detrimental to any kind of hit and run strategy that we have. And it's going to be especially important against Imperial Guard that we get a good battle focus roll so that we can move back behind terrain after we shoot. And as for the Warlord traits, we have Master Tactician and Grand Strategist, and I believe these are the best ones for the Imperial Guard and the ones that are going to give us the most problems. So Master Tactician essentially allows up to 3 Imperial Guard units to redeploy, or they can also be put into Strategic Reserve for no additional cost. This is 1 command point. So this is basically an improved Phantasm, again, that only costs 1 command point for the Warlord trait. Now, I kind of did a little bit of digging, and I was kind of like, is this actually better than Phantasm? Is there anything that's, different from it? Like maybe it doesn't allow units to go into Strategic Reserve or something like that. And well, alas, nope. It's exactly the same. It just costs 1 less command point, and it's a Warlord trait. So there you have it. Really, there's no difference. It's just a cheaper version of Phantasm that is better. Now, the only thing I can think of is that Imperial Guard units are generally cheaper and more fodderish. But again, this can also be used to redeploy some very high-profile units like Leman Russ battle tanks, Deathstrike missile launchers, Rogaldorn battle tanks, and things like that. So it's not just limited to infantry. You can redeploy pretty much any unit in the army, up to 3, and you can put them in Strategic Reserve, which is an absolutely great ability. And again, Phantasm, we all love it, we all know it, we all love using it almost every single game, and now Imperial Guard have access to it for, of course, 1 less command point. And the next one that's really good is Grand Strategist. This is basically a rebranded Seer of the Shifting Vector. On a 5+ for each friendly command point spent, you gain 1 command point. It's still capped at 1 command point. It's only for friendly command points spent. So unlike Seer of the Shifting Vector, enemy command point usage will not count. But I don't know. It's basically just a rebranded version of it. I don't think it's any better or worse, personally. I think it's probably about the same. But even so, it's a really powerful ability that basically keeps Imperial Guard from running out of command points in any given turn. So pretty good ability, pretty solid, and you'll probably see this more often than not on one of the enemy characters. So moving on to the most powerful Imperial Guard units. So the most powerful Imperial Guard units and the ones that are most common that you'll see on the tabletop more often than not are going to be Cadian Shock Troops, Kasrkins, Rough Riders, Sentinels, Leman Russ battle tanks, the Deathstrike missile launcher, and of course, heavy weapon teams. And the great thing about the Guard book is it actually has a lot of power outside of these main core units They have a lot of great units. I think Hellhounds are pretty good. There's, a lot of decent other units in the Codex, but these are the most common, right? And again, Sentinels are very powerful. I think the Scout Sentinel is probably the better of the two personally, but the Armored Sentinel is still good as well. So there's a lot of options in this new Guard Codex that are very strong. So first up, we have the Cadian Shock Troops, and the Cadian Shock Troops are basically an improved version of the normal Imperial Guard Infantry Squad. They can take 2 special weapons, but no heavy weapons. They're basic as far as their stats go, but that's not really why they're good. They're good because they're only 65 points, so again, pretty cheap. And each 6 to hit with a last gun or last pistol scores an additional hit. So this is what makes them the premier choice for your opponent. And there's no real limit to this. So, unless your opponent wants to take a heavy weapon in the unit, typically they're going to be taking Cadian Shock Troops, and they're very effective. I mean, just because their last guns are, strength 3, they can, obviously benefit from a lot of orders like first rank fire, second rank fire, and that really helps with their special ability of each 6 to hit scores an additional hit. Very powerful. So some of their counters are Swooping Hawks, Warp Spiders, and of course Scatter Lasers. Swooping Hawks being able to take out infantry and then leap back to safety without fear of retaliation. This is very powerful. Swooping Hawks are very good against Imperial Guard infantry. Warp Spiders absolutely shred them, but again, they can be a little bit vulnerable to counterattack, so the Web of Deceit ability is very helpful here for helping them make up their points. And then Scatter Lasers are effective as well, but you do need to be able to hide them behind terrain. So taking Scatter Lasers on something that can't get behind terrain reliably is probably not the best idea. I like Warwalkers. They have powerful damage capabilities, but unfortunately, unless you're using Fire and Fade, Warwalkers cannot get behind terrain enough in a game to actually be effective against clearing out this chaff. So you do have to be careful for that as well. Shroud Runners are very good in this matchup for a number of reasons, but they're also very effective against Imperial Guard infantry. Then we have the Castrican. The Castrican are a little bit better than Imperial Guardsmen or Cadians. They hit on 3+ and have a 4+ save. They have Hotshot Last Guns, which have an AP of 2. Otherwise, they're pretty much the same. And the Castricans can take up to 4 special weapons per unit. So this can be 2 Plasma Guns or 2 Melta-Guns or whatever else you desire. Even the Hotshot Volley Gun, which is a more powerful version of the Hotshot Last Gun. So in addition to this, these guys get an additional doctrine for free. So it's essentially like getting an extra far-flung Craftworld trait for the unit. So they can have Born Soldiers, and they can also have something like Expert Snipers or Bombardiers or whatever. I don't know what else, they have. The one that ignores cover is pretty good as well. Recon Specialist is pretty good. They have a lot of good ones there. So they can take an extra trait. However, they can't deep strike, but they can use the Barbican's Key, which is arguably better than Deep Strike because it doesn't allow them to be vulnerable to things like Forewarned and Auspex Scan and things like that. They can basically just start on the board, teleport wherever they want, do all their damage, and then because the unit is fairly cheap, the unit's only about 100 points base, that it's just going to be expendable at that point. So they take out 200 points worth of models, and then they get taken out themselves, and they've done their job, essentially. So with these guys, you do have to be careful and watch out for them and make sure that you don't leave any of your expensive units open to this kind of thing. But these guys are very effective, and they're part of this really insane combo with the Barbican's Key, with overcharged last cells and things like that, that just absolutely decimates a large portion of most of your army if you leave them in the open like that. So watch out for these guys. And a couple of their counters are actually, again, Swooping Hawks. Great anti-infantry ability and can jump back to safety afterwards. Fantastic against a large array of enemy infantry for Imperial Guard. Warp Spiders, again, shred them, but can be vulnerable to counterattack. Again, Web of Deceit is very helpful. And then Scatter Lasers are effective as well, but need to get back behind terrain. So basically, everything that was effective against Cadians is also going to be effective against Castrican to a slightly lesser degree. But again, I think it's important to note that most of our anti-infantry weapons are going to absolutely shred Castrican and Cadian shock troops. They're not the toughest units. The key is making effective trades. So something I don't mention here, which I do kind of want to mention real quick, is the power of a unit of 5 Dire Avengers with the twin Shuriken Catapult Exarch. The reason why I go into this is because that unit is actually very good at trading with Imperial Guard units. Now, why do I say this? Now, if they can hide behind a piece of obscuring terrain, they can get a good position and just pop out, shoot their 18 inches, and then run back to safety. They can actually make up more than their points worth in the course of a game. They are very good. So a unit of 5 actually has about 18 shots, and that means that without buffs, 12 are going to hit, and about 9 are going to wound. And those wounds against, armor 5+ models, they're not going to get a save against those. So 5 Dire Avengers can actually, on average, kill almost an entire unit of Imperial Guardsmen and then run back to safety. And the squad costs 65 points. An Imperial Guard squad costs 65 points. So I think actually this particular unit is extremely effective. Well, I should say cost effective against Imperial Guard infantry units. So again, not a lot of people are going to be spamming units of 5 Dire Avengers unless they're running Hail of Doom, but in this case, they do actually have quite a bit of a good matchup against their infantry point for point. Next up is Rough Riders. Now, Rough Riders, I originally thought were going to be this broken unit, but as I thought about it more, if I looked at their rules, the cavalry rules and things like that, I learned that they're probably not going to be as broken as I originally thought. Of course, if they do get a charge off on something big, they are going to kill it. They are going to basically kill anything. Even a Wraith Knight can be killed with the right buffs and rolls from a unit of Rough Riders. They're very fast and can advance in charge. But they have a little bit of an issue with terrain because they are cavalry and they are fairly easy to kill. They're only toughness 4 with 2 wounds at a 4+ save. It's just not really going to be that great. And most of the time you can, as an Eldar player, maneuver in such a way that you can actually kill these guys off. So some of their counters include using ruins to your advantage, as they are obviously going to be having trouble charging through them, buildings as well, or using screening units like Rangers, or perhaps even a Viper can be very effective as well, because even though they do advance and charge, they have movement 12 and can advance, a Viper is just big enough to where if you put this in their way, they might actually not be able to make most charges. So Vipers are a very good tool to use, and Vipers are only 40 points, which is actually much cheaper than a unit of Rough Riders. So if they want to charge your Viper, go ahead. They'll kill the Viper, but then they're going to get lit up themselves. So very good trade there. Of course, anti-infantry weapons also do a great job at killing them, as they're pretty paper thin, and even Overwatch on certain units can mess them up pretty badly. So if they decide to charge a unit of Shroud Runners, for example, between the Wire Weave Grenades and Overwatch, the Rough Rider is going to have a really hard time being able to survive that. And again, just for reference sake, your unit of Shroud Runners, if it's a unit of 5 that is, again, it has to probably be a max unit to be able to do as much Overwatch damage as I typically am used to, but it has to be guided as well. So guided Overwatch can be very effective at eliminating those units. Okay, so on to the Sentinels. So the Sentinels are pretty much fully revamped. They have better stats than they used to, and they have better special rules. So they have 2 variants, the Scout and Armored variant. The Scout variant has advanced positions, and it makes it extremely effective at denying units like Rangers and Striking Scorpions from deploying easily. It's extremely cheap and fairly durable for the cost. I think a Sentinel is about 40 points base. And most of its weapon options are free, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think they're either free or very cheap. And these are effectively throwaway units that your enemy can use to gain the positional advantage early in the game and score on objectives. So basically they force you to react. So they force you to come out of hiding, try to kill them, and then of course, what's waiting for you? Well, a million last guns and a million battle tank cannons and stuff like that, right? So these Sentinels are a way to open up that negotiation. Let's just put it that way. So what are some of the counters to this? Well, a great effective counter that is, well, a little bit dismissed as far as an anti-tank option against heavier vehicles, especially now with Armor of Contempt and Toughness 9 vehicles roaming around. But essentially, Bright Lances are pretty effective, and you really only need a few to be lethal. So a couple Bright Lances with a Strands of Fate roll can put a Sentinel in the dust pretty quickly. And not for nothing, Scatter Lasers and Shuriken Cannons aren't terrible versus the Scout variant, as it only has a 4+ save and 7 wounds, And the Scout variant only has toughness 6. So you're going to be wounding on 4+ most of the time. And because it has a 4+ save, it doesn't have Armor of Contempt or anything like that. It can go down very quickly to basically just medium heavy infantry firepower. So shuriken cannons, scatter lasers, even star cannons if you do take them. And I'm not a big fan of star cannons in most matchups, but you know, if you already have them in your army and you like star cannons, these can be pretty effective against the Sentinel as well, because they won't be getting a save against it, and each wound dealt is going to be doing 2 wounds. So, you know, maybe 4 or 5 star cannons and you can put one of these in the dirt. But most of the time, that's not going to be that cost effective. You're really going to be looking at bright lances, scatter lasers, and shuriken cannons for putting these down in the early game. And then we have the big boys. So the Leman Russ battle tanks. So these are extremely tough with toughness 8 and a 2+ save. They will probably lose Armor of Contempt in the next expansion. Right now, they officially have it, but a lot of players I find are playing without it just because they recognize that it's probably going to be lost. It's not directly in the Codex, so they're getting used to it. It has absolutely great damage. It's best-in-class damage with multiple types of variants. In my opinion, I think the ones that stand out are the Battle Cannon and Demolisher Cannon. Those are the most deadly to me, and the ones that seem to be good against most targets in the game. And they're actually kind of fast, believe it or not. They're only movement 10, but they have this order that basically allows them to advance and shoot without penalty. And that is very effective. So when they advance, I think they advance even more than the normal 2d6, or excuse me, d6, when they're given that order. But even so, this can be extremely dangerous if you do not expect a Leman Russ to move this fast. And the Leman Russ can use this to get angles on your units out of line of sight. So if you're not expecting this, you can be in for a really rude awakening. And let me tell you, I was in for one of these awakenings in one of my first games when they rolled a 6 for their, I think it's called move, but I could be mistaking that with something else. But basically, it's an order that allows the Leman Russ battle tank to advance and shoot without penalty, and the advance roll is boosted somehow, I believe. But in any case, if you're not expecting this, you can actually be quite in for a shock, and this is what happened to one of my units of D cannons early in the game. Now, the other thing about the Leman Russ battle tank, believe it or not, is a little trick that Imperial Guard players can use is that they can actually use one of the sponsons on the side to gain line of sight to you if it's a close thing. So basically how line of sight works is you can draw line of sight from any part of your model to any part of the enemy model. So the sponsons kind of stick out on the sides a lot, and what some Imperial Guard players will do is they'll use those sponsons as line of sight points, right? They'll use that to draw line of sight to your enemy unit. So it gives them about 1 inch, I think it's about an inch or a little bit less than an inch of extra line of sight angle. So you do kind of have to be aware of this when measuring and making sure that your units are out of line of sight. Now, what are some counters to Leman Russ battle tank? So I actually think that the 2 biggest counters to these units are units that we've kind of neglected in the past couple of books because they haven't really been seen as that effective against Chaos Demons and stuff like that. But essentially Fire Prisms, because if you can draw your line of sight to them, you can wreck them without even using linked fire because they don't have an invul save base. So what that means is you're hitting on 3s, you're wounding on 3s, and you're doing a bunch of damage to that vehicle. You have AP -5, so likely you're going to be ignoring their armor. And on average, you're going to be doing about 3d3 damage, which is about 6 damage per shot. You get 2 shots per hit. Per Fire Prism. So a couple of Fire Prisms will easily put down a Leman Russ battle tank in a single turn, no questions asked. Now, Fire Dragons are also very effective against it, and I actually think that Fire Dragons are more cost-effective than Fire Prisms in a lot of ways because Fire Dragons actually can trade 1-for-1 with the Leman Russ battle tank. So against a unit of Fire Dragons, the Leman Russ costs about 150, 160 points with sponsons, and a Fire Dragon squad only costs about 120 points. And if you want to choose the upgrade, it only costs 140. So either way, you're still spending less points on those Fire Dragons, and they can trade pretty much 1-for-1 with Guide or with the Doom to ensure the kill. Again, bad rolling can happen, so always put guide on your units that you want to ensure that they can hit and kill the enemy unit, of course. So Fire Dragon's very effective against Imperial Guard, and they're not only good against Leman Russ battle tanks, they're good against a large variety of Imperial vehicles. Even Bane Blades and things like that, they're pretty effective against, right? So Fire Dragon's very good pick against the Imperial Guard for tank killing, and D-Cannons can also devastate them if they can find the range. So I think D-Cannons, unfortunately, have to be used a little bit differently in a lot of these games, because Imperial Guard have the luxury of just sitting back on their own objectives in the backfield outside of the range of the D-Cannon. So they don't typically have to move their Leman Russ battle tanks up unless they want direct line of sight on something. So they will move up eventually, just not in the first couple turns of the game typically, at least not within range of your D-Cannon, so within those 30 inches. They will move their infantry up. Your D-Cannons will have targets, but not the best targets typically. So D-Cannons still obviously do a ton of damage, but you're probably going to have to use your D-Cannons a little bit more efficiently against the Imperial Guard and have other ways of dealing with their big tanks in the back. And again, you know, some players might argue that you don't really have to do anything. You just have to stay out of line of sight, and Leman Russ battle tanks aren't really going to be that much of a problem for the vast majority of your units. But you do want to be able to take those out at some point in the game, so, you know, you're going to have to probably think about being a little bit more aggressive with your D-Cannons so that you can get some damage against those vehicles. And that probably will happen around turn 4 or 5. And honestly, you know, I played a couple of games myself against an opponent that I did have D-Cannons, and I was playing against, you know, 3 Imperial Russes or 3 Leman Russ battle tanks. And patience is key here. You don't want to jump the gun. If you move up turn 1, you're just going to get out-traded. D-Cannons cost 195 points for the unit, and a Leman Russ is only 160. So that's not really a trade you want to make in the early game. I would just be patient with them in the early game, shoot what you can, and then in the later game, when they do inevitably move their battle tanks up into a better position, you can then shoot them and kill them and make up their points worth. So moving on to the Death Strike, a lot of people have found the Death Strike to be a bit of a meme in past editions, and indeed, it has been a meme in, you know, past editions. When it came out, for example, in 5th and 6th edition, it was never that great, so forth. But the Death Strike, I think, has a pretty reliable place in competitive play. And I know a lot of people, Imperial Guard players, might actually disagree with this. But there's a very specific reason why you would use something like this, and it's basically to crack the toughest targets in the game that you're not going to have line of sight to. So in certain matchups, you might have armies like aka Eldar, right, who have numerous units behind terrain that they're going to essentially hide behind for the rest of the game. And things like mortars just aren't going to be able to cut it against certain units. So this is why you bring the Death Strike. And basically what this does is it allows you to essentially destroy units that are camping behind obscuring terrain. Here's the thing, though. The Death Strike, although it is a big deterrent to camp a lot of models behind a single piece of terrain, it's not really effective at destroying multiple units behind that terrain, especially if they're Eldar and especially if they have a quick response and movement. So basically, here's how this thing works. It's one shot per game. It has varied missile types that you have to pick before the game starts. You don't have to pick it in your list, but you do have to select it when you see your opponent's forces. And it's basically good against a variety of different targets. Now, it essentially gives you a turn to select a position on the board, and then in the next turn, it fires. So this actually gives your opponent a turn to actually get out of the way. So with Eldar, it's very easy to just move fast out of the way, right? We don't have particularly slow units, and we can oftentimes get out of that marker range. But this is a double-edged sword because obviously Eldar are very squishy, and if they're outside of obscuring terrain, they're dead anyway. Other units are going to kill them. So this kind of sets up a catch-22 where you die if you stay behind obscuring terrain, and you die if you go out in the open. And as for the different missile types, the God Spear is the hardest hitting, but it's also the smallest marker. So I think it only affects units within gosh, I want to say 6 inches or 3 inches. It's very small. I think it's actually 3 inches of the marker. So very tiny radius, but it does extreme amounts of damage, up to 18 mortal wounds worth of damage if you roll a 6. Most of the time, though, you're going to be doing 12 mortal wounds. The Vortex does a lot less damage. I think it does like 2 to 3 mortal wounds, but it stays in play. So the marker stays in play for an additional turn on 4+ or something like that. And this can actually stay in play for a long time if you roll lucky enough. But basically, the other one is the Plasma, which is the most well-rounded. It does decent damage. It'll probably kill most of our units on average with 4 or 5 mortal wounds. And it has a pretty big radius. So what are some good counters to the Death Strike? So the good counters that I can see to the Death Strike are just good positioning and speed. And luckily, Eldar have both in absolute spades. Falcons can also Cloud Strike in on turn 1 to get a better angle to blow it up. Strands of Fate and command points can help out with this as long as your opponent didn't bring that Master of the Fleet I talked about earlier that can delay reserves for 1 turn. Warwalkers with advanced positions can also take it out pretty easily with Bright Lances as long as your opponent didn't screen out his own positions beforehand with his own Scout Sentinels. So remember what I said, if they're bringing Scout Sentinels and they're, able to actually screen out your positions, you'll be unable to do anything. So make sure that you choose a good position or use your Ranger units beforehand to create a safe area for your Warwalkers to deploy. And it's kind of big, so unless it's fully behind obscuring terrain, it's going to be hard to hide, which means you can get good angles on it because of the Craftworld Eldar inherent speed and agility and maneuverability. You can actually, in turn 1, get angles on it with things like Wave Serpents, Falcons, and anything really fast. And it really doesn't take too much to kill. I think it only has about 12 wounds or something like that at toughness 7 with a 3-up armor save, so Bright Lances just absolutely rip through it. And lastly, we have heavy weapon teams. So heavy weapon teams are basically cheap and plentiful. They're 55 points base. You can give them pretty much any weapon on there. And the most common choice now is going to be mortars. Mortars, that may change when the new rules come out on indirect fire and how that interacts with Imperial Guard. But as for now, 55 points for a unit that can clear out things like cultists, rangers, and stuff like that is a very cost-effective option. They can also benefit from orders as well, increasing their damage. However, they are very squishy. So some of the counters to this unit, just pretty much anything that kills them as long as you can draw a line of sight, right? They're going to be in the backfield, so units like Swooping Hawks or Warp Spiders that can get close to them very easily will wipe them out, no problem. If anything, it'll be overkill. And here's the thing about mortars, though. They really don't threaten much outside of very squishy units like Rangers. So yes, they can kill your Rangers. They can do okay damage against things like Guardians and things like that. But against anything heavier, with a 3+ save or out of line of sight, they're really just not going to do much damage. And to give you an example, a unit like Shroud Runners would be something that they'd like to target. Against Shroud Runners, they're wounding on 4+. I mean, they could get an order to, boost their effectiveness a little bit. But again, Shroud Runners are going to be basically getting a 1-up save against them from the cover that they're going to be in. And pretty soon, I'm almost positive they're going to lose that indirect fire buff. So as for now, mortars do okay against Shroud Runners. They're not really the best, but I think when the new rules data slate drops in January, I think we're going to see the Imperial Guard lose that. And because of that, I think they're just not going to be doing that much damage to units like that. But they can do pretty good damage against other units. They're fairly decent against things like Swooping Hawks, even though Swooping Hawks do have some defenses against it. If you have enough mortars, your Swooping Hawks will eventually just absolutely drown in saves. So you do need to have an answer to these mortars within the first couple turns of the game if you don't want to lose your key units that are relying on line of sight, blocking, or obscuring terrain. So what are some things you should watch out for and how to play against a new Imperial Guard? So one of the things is the Barbican Ski combo. You need to be aware of that before you play against them. You need to be aware that a lot of your units are going to be susceptible to making bad trades if you're not careful. You need to avoid overly aggressive play styles because, again, You got to change it up a little bit. Imperial Guard have a lot of ways to disrupt incredibly aggressive Alpha Strike styles. And use your Rangers to get the positional advantage first so that the Sentinels don't get the positional advantage on the battlefield and basically stop you from deploying your advanced position units. So the first thing is you need to be aware, like I said before, of the Barbican combo. It's absolutely disgusting. They can basically just kill 3 units with mortal wounds alone. It can deep strike. It can position anywhere outside of 9 inches. So if you're not correctly screened, units like Swooping Hawks, Warp Spiders that are hiding behind obscuring terrain will get absolutely nerfed into the ground and destroyed. So screen out your units behind line of sight and don't give the Kasrkins juicy targets during the first few turns. And with Imperial Guard, making bad trades is also something you can make a mistake with. So try to avoid trading your valuable units like Howling Banshees or striking Scorpions with their regular infantry units. So unless you can hit 2 units at the same time, or you can consolidate out of line of sight, your units will always trade down. So in a vast majority of the cases, if you charge in a unit of Howling Banshees into a unit of Guardsmen, you'll obliterate them, and then you'll come out on the other end and they will just shoot you to death. And if that's the case, you're going to be trading down because your 110 or 115 point unit is going to be only able to kill 65 points of the enemy and then die horribly. So you definitely don't want to trade your units for that. So be careful. Make sure to use your shooting in the first couple of turns and save your combat units for later when they can make more impactful plays on the battlefield. And next, avoid being overly aggressive. Now, I know that some lists basically hinge on the fact that you're alpha striking them. You're going to destroy so much of the enemy force in the first couple turns that the game is basically impossible for your opponent to win. That's the alpha strike strategy, but it doesn't really work that well against Imperial Guard, I have to say. I did play a game with a more alpha strike centric force. I actually played my Webway Warriors and Mobile Fighters list that I did I basically did a video on it a while back. I used that against the New Guard thinking it was going to do a ton of damage to them and wipe them off the board. It absolutely flopped. And the reason why it flopped was because Imperial Guard have a lot of ways to disrupt Alpha Strike. So between the Master of the Fleet, tank shooting on death, and easy access to cheap screens, the Imperial Guard have several ways to absolutely blunt an Alpha Strike and simply absorb the damage and hit back twice as hard. So in that particular list, I had a unit of Fire Dragons that shot last against a unit of, just a single Leman Russ battle tank, because they don't technically count as units of 3 when they're taken in squadrons. They're separate. But yeah, shot it, killed it, and then it returned fire and killed something of mine. So again, this happened multiple times throughout the first couple of turns of the game, and I just basically decided that, Alpha Strike probably isn't the best tool to deal with the new Imperial Guard. And of course, I had reserves that were being delayed and things like that. So not a pretty picture there. But if you try to use your units more defensively, I actually played several games after that with a more defensive style list, and it worked much better. So again, use your units more defensively and force the Guard to move out onto objectives so that you can pick them off out in the open, and their defensive capabilities will be less utilized and less impactful in the game. And lastly, try to use your Rangers to get positional advantage first. So try to deploy your Rangers first, so basically stop your opponent from using their Scout Sentinels to block you off of early objectives. And this will prevent some of their early game scoring attempts and give you a positional advantage on the battlefield. And basically, after that, you can always use Phantasm to move your Rangers back in your deployment zone to safety so that they can score on secondary objectives themselves. So you don't have to sacrifice your 3 units of Rangers out there. You can always Phantasm them back if needed, even if it's not, let me put it this way, even if you do not get turn 1, you can always move them back with Phantasm either way. And this will give you a lot of early board control. This will make it harder for him to actually maneuver into a better position and force your opponent to make a lot of hard decisions. Do they want to move out their Leman Russ battle tanks first? And basically, they're going to have to decide what units they want to sacrifice. And, it could just be infantry. But again, if it's just infantry, you have easy ways to shoot their infantry down and then just hide again. After all, you are playing Craftworld Eldar. So we do have battle focus, we do have fire and fade, and we do have a lot of ways to move back behind terrain once we have shot. So again, Imperial Guard during the first few turns are either going to have to play very defensively and lose out on objective points, or they're going to have to choose to sacrifice friendly units to be able to move out onto no man's land. And again, just like the trailers and just like the little animations that you always see from content creators making, content about Imperial Guard and the lives of Imperial Guard, into the breach. And I'm sorry, guys, but you're not returning from this campaign because you are going to be destroyed and decimated. So again, your opponent is going to have to make some very hard decisions in the first couple of turns of the game on how they want to move up their forces and in what amounts. Because again, the positional advantage is going to be all yours. And there are really good Imperial Guard players out there who can manage something like this and can be very effective against an Eldar force, but it is a little bit tricky. And as long as you can make and force your opponent to make hard tactical decisions, you're going to increase the chances that you're going to win and come out alive at the end of that game. So definitely make sure that your Rangers are used for this basically role in the beginning. So in conclusion, I think the new Imperial Guard are an extremely powerful foe with extremely strong shooting and objective power. They're an absolutely brutal codex, I have to say. And I did not win all of my games against them. I have to admit, I've played several games against them recently, just the new codex and everything. Now, of course, there is stuff that's going to be nerfed and stuff like that, but it was extremely hard, and it was a bit of a shock to see all the new cool stuff that the Imperial Guard had, and the fact that they had so many tools to shore up and to cover a lot of the weaknesses that they had in the previous book. All of those weaknesses, by the way, are completely gone. The only weakness that maybe stayed was their inherent squishiness, which of course is always going to be the case. They're Imperial Guardsmen, right? They're always going to be squishy. They're always going to be probably toughness 3 with a 5-up armor save. And to beat them, you really have to play a precise game with Craftworld Eldar with very little mistakes, especially when it comes to movement and getting behind obscuring terrain. And on top of that, you have to play a more defensive type game that involves picking off enemy units in the early game when they appear, when they go on objectives, and using the later turns to go on the offensive once a lot of their hitting power is gone. So again, you don't want to kill their Leman Russ battle tanks and expose yourself only to be destroyed by 10,000 las guns, right? And the opposite is also true. You don't want to decimate their entire platoon of infantry only to face down 3 or 4 battle cannons buffed up with orders or things like that. And you really just don't want to be caught out in the open in general during the mid-game when your Imperial Guard foe has a lot of his army left. You're just not going to be able to survive that much firepower. So if you play a defensive game, though, and you play to the strengths of the Eldar, which is basically hide and seek, you'll be able to come out on top. Now, for those of you who have Wraith Guard armies and Wraith Lord armies, I sincerely apologize. I think that, to be honest with you, the way the new codexes have been going, they've been given a lot of tools to deal with exceptionally tough units. And I think Wraith Guard they rely a lot on their toughness to be able to survive attacks. And it just doesn't look like they're going to be able to really survive against the new Imperial Guard Codex. And to be honest with you guys, a lot of tougher factions are also going to have big issues dealing with this. Even big blocks of Terminators are going to have problems dealing with, 60 plus Cadians, getting additional hits on 6s to hit, using first rank fire, second rank fire. It's going to be an absolute mess. Of course, your opponent is going to be rolling 1s, right? Especially if you're throwing battle cannons at them on top of that. It's going to be very hard for your enemy to actually do much of anything if you're running that kind of list. Now, having said that, I do think Wraith Guard can be used effectively to kill things like Leman Russ battle tanks, and maybe not trade up, but at least trade even with a couple of those things. I know that, Wraith cannons are pretty effective, even though they're a bit expensive, and, D-sights are pretty effective at killing things like Bulgrins and stuff like that. So Wraith units can definitely be used effectively. I just think they're going to have a harder time than most of our other units in the Codex against this particular matchup. All right, everybody, that's going to be it today. Later this week, I want to either post a video based on one of the battles that I had against Imperial Guard. I want to kind of show you step by step how I was able to actually win this particular battle. I did lose some battles as well. And actually, the first battle I fought was against a Born Soldiers list using a Webway Warriors and Mobile Fighters list of my own with Deep Striking Falcons, and it did not go well. I actually think I almost got tabled within 4 or so turns. So again, rough start. but I will share with you a couple of the games that I did have success with running Uthway, of course, using a more defensive strategy. And I'm going to go ahead and show you that in a later video. And in general, leave a comment if you want to share some of your own experiences with the new Guard Codex. If you have tried an Alpha Strike strategy and it worked, let me know how you did it. I'd really like to know how you got past some of the defensive abilities and stuff like that. If you have a few tips and tricks and Eldar trickery of your own, let us know so that we can use it in our own games. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. I will see you guys later. Have a great one. Sorry this video took so long. It was a big work in progress. I wanted to get some games in this weekend before I actually did the video. Obviously, to have experience for you guys to actually, know what I'm talking about. But anyway, all right, everybody, have a good one. Peace out. See you guys in the next video.